Shh. Hear that? Big waves are calling. Dive into refreshment with Kona Big Wave. Tropical flavor and the taste of aloha in every drop. So crack one open and let the great taste roll in. Kona Big Wave, liquid aloha. Copyright 2025 Kona Brewing Co., St. Louis, Missouri. Mahalo for enjoying responsibly.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. Knowing you could be saving money for the things you really want, like that dream house or ride, is a great feeling. That's why the State Farm Personal Price Plan can help you save when you choose to bundle home and auto. Bundling, just another way to save with the Personal Price Plan. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
When you wanna grow your list size, pop up like it's hot, pop up like it's hot, pop up like it's hot. And when you gotta boost your revenue, pop up like it's hot, hey, pop up like it's hot, pop up like it's hot. Pick your favorite template, you can tailor to your brand. They're MailChimp-erific, you're gonna be a fan. MailChimp your marketing with our new customizable pop-ups.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Makkai, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. In Jennine Capó Crucet's newest wild ride of a Miami novel, Say Hello to My Little Friend, Ismael Reyes, you can call him Ismael, has had to forgo his life's work and passion of becoming the world's best Pitbull impersonator. The singer, not the dog. But when lawyers serve him a cease and desist, he needs a new model of success at all costs. A Cuban-American entrepreneur, and who better to fit that bill than Tony Montana, the drug-dealing immigrant of the Brian De Palma cult classic Scarface. Tony had his sidekick, Manolo, so Izzy needs a Manolo. Tony had his Michelle Pfeiffer, the cold and beautiful woman on his arm, and so Izzy needs a Pfeiffer. But that's not the final piece of the puzzle. Crucet has another protagonist, lest we find Izzy too conventional, an orca named Lolita, languishing in the SeaWorld stand-in Seaquarium. Lolita, like Izzy, has these sensory memories of her journey to this unfamiliar place where she must perform for her food and care, and as with Izzy, she is scanning the world around her for a species of like-minded animal, the possible link to new beginnings and different, better choices. Two very different animals are on a collision course towards one another, and where they meet will have everything to do with what it means to be in exile and an immigrant and a king of Miami, a man or a whale free from the binds of the present and full of the meaning of the past. And that narrative duo is only the start of the pleasures of Crucet's novel. A writer of enormous spirit and play, there is not 1 ounce of slack in the language of Say Hello to My Little Friend. No joke that isn't doubled or tripled, no image that doesn't sear, from the scenes of clearing hordes of iguanas off Miami streets to a dinner at a tapas restaurant in the back of a gas station. The title is a perfect evocation of the dilemma whirling inside this book. A desire to take the world by storm, as symbolized by Tony Montana wielding his machine gun in the film's most iconic scene, and the idea of friendship and community, something that confuses and eludes, even as it draws both Izzy and Lolita inexorably forward to their fates. Rarely does a novel catch me so off guard with such wonderful rewards. Jennine is a novelist, an essayist, and screenwriter. She's the author of 3 books, including the novel Make Your Home Among Strangers, which won the International Latino Book Award and was named New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and has been adopted as an all-campus read at over 40 U.S. universities. Her other books include the story collection, How to Leave Hialeah, which won the Iowa Short Fiction Prize, the John Gardner Book Award, and the essay collection, My Time Among the Whites, Notes from an Unfinished Education, which was longlisted for the 2019 PEN America Open Book Award. A former contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, she is also a recipient of a PEN O. Henry Prize, a Picador Fellowship, and the Hillsdale Award for the short story, awarded by the Fellowship of Southern Writers. Born and raised in Miami to Cuban parents, her fourth book, a novel titled Say Hello to My Little Friend, is not forthcoming, but here from Simon & Schuster. She lives in North Carolina with her family. Welcome to Burned by Books, Jennine.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me. I'm good with what you just said about the novel. That was wonderful.
Well, I'm so glad to have you here. This novel it blew my hair back. I thought it was just so intensely fun and profound and meaningful and layered. And it might feature the strangest pairing of protagonists that I have read, certainly in years. Izzy, the disgraced Pitbull impersonator, and Lolita, the star orca at Seaquarium. So how did these two characters and voices end up in this kind of nexus that became the central of the novel in a, lightly fictionalized Miami?
Yeah, that's a great question because it was the biggest challenge for me trying to construct the novel. I knew I really wanted to write about Lolita. I really just kind of wanted to write about the whale, but I sort of knew that it's hard to have a book center on a protagonist that is, right? It's hard to kind of quite literally going in circles. And so, but I'd also started a novel I didn't know if it was going to be a novel, a short story. I really didn't know what it was other than a kind of catharsis. I had read Percival Everett's Erasure in 2013, I think was the year I read it. So not right when it came out, but definitely before this, everybody's talking about Erasure because of the movie American Fiction. And sort of like when there's a band you love and then it gets popular and you always want to be like, I've been here since before they were on the radio. So I've been recommending Erasure to every person I know for, over a decade. But I was reading that novel while my first novel was on submission to American publishers. And there was this sort of reaction of like, well, we really love the novel, but it's not what we expected. It's not like a Cuban novel. It doesn't feel like what we thought a Cuban American novel would sound like. And some of them were not themselves Cuban American. And I started, Erasure found me. I was living in Germany at the time, and the version I have is not the American version, right? Not the U.S. printing. I sort of feel like it found me at the exact right time because, it's got a novel inside of itself. It is sort of like a novel written from a place of spite, right? Like the novel inside that the protagonist of Erasure writes is just like almost like a protest. And I think, well, I'm going to do this. Yeah, I'm going to do this for myself. I'm going to write a fake book, a fake novel it sort of panders to all the expectations, and you sort of make fun of those expectations or those demands, right? I'm like, I'm going to write a Scarface light. Well, I'm going to write, that's what people want. They want a Scarface light. And somehow the idea of the whale found her way in. I can't even really tell you how it happened because it just happened. I don't, writing can be very magical that way. And I think it started from this place of like anger, maybe, or spite. And then the whale, once that voice found its way into the book, once that consciousness found its way into the book, it couldn't be that anymore. And it changed, completely, right? Like the initial idea of what the book was going to be was so different from what it ended up being because of the power of that voice sort of taking over. And I think the way I figured it out was water. I was like, that's what connects all of us. That's what connects, we're made of water. She's submerged in water. There's water inside of her. I think I learned in fact that orca don't drink water. They get all their water from their food. And that made me start thinking about what is food and like, can people be food? I don't know. It just turned into I was in a weird headspace when it all came together. And in that moment where Izzy goes to the aquarium and the water from Lolita's tank touches him, and that's it. There's like a bond there that's sort of, that only she understands, but he can feel, even if he doesn't know what it is. So water was sort of the way in. I had to get elemental, so to speak, to figure out how these two consciousnesses were going to be in any kind of contact.
it's but you don't lose the. Yeah, I mean, the anger is still there, and perhaps the spite in the farcicalness of especially Izzy's line of much of the plot. His driving ambitions are these two very different men who symbolize in this caricatured way, really in the way that Erasure like critiques of ideals and possibilities of life for a Cuban immigrant in Miami, Pitbull, and then Tony Montana. And one of them, operates as this symbol of iconic commercial success, and the other one is this sort of immigrant willing to do anything to survive and thrive. And so I wonder how you wanted to balance one, trying to like add in like quite a bit of like farce and satiring this idea that they in some way stand in for what what an archetypal like Cuban American should yearn for, but then also have Izzy develop as a character with real and much more textured emotions and ways of seeing the world.
Yeah. Wait, I agree with all that you said, but I'm not sure how. I'm like, what's the question? Because I see
so
it.
my question is like, how do you do balance that? How did you realize that you were still like that idea you had that you were kind of wanting to write in a sort of spiteful way about how much these archetypes are thrown around, but then also have it be a much more real and textured human? Yeah,
it's a great question. I don't know that it even a balance. I think something took over, right? I think humor took over, and that sort of realizing it was ridiculous to be upset. I don't know. It wasn't ridiculous to be upset, but the ridiculousness of what I was writing against versus letting it like get to me in a different way, and that I had a lot more fun poking fun at it, and that anger, I don't know, I think anger plus humor equals satire, maybe. And that the book itself became a thing that reminded me what's really important about art and about literature, and that it sort of like righted the ship for me internally, and that I have to write the book I'm meant to write, and I can't really control how they're received, if that like that sort of makes sense, but I can control I really just started making myself laugh so much as I was working through this book, and really trying to put out of my head, like, are other readers going to find this? Are they going to get the humor? And I'm like, well, they can. They can. If the possibility is there, and that's all I can control. So that balancing act was sort of just seeing how Izzy just was like, you're right. He is he picks these two sort of things that are themselves caricatures between Tony Montana and someone like Pitbull. And then without giving away sort of like the end of the book, when that sort of started to see the very last thing that happened in the book started being on the horizon, I didn't know exactly how the book was going to end, other than like, if a book is purporting to be Scarface and Moby Dick, we know both those pieces of art, things don't end well for the main character. So, you can make your guesses about what's going to happen to Izzy. But I was like, when you think about like what really happens, like that there's just more. There's got to be so much more. There is a beating heart under that kind of pain, and anger might be. There's a quote that I have on like everybody work. I have like an Anne Carson quote on my like writer bulletin board.
Oh, nice.
It sort of always sits there, and it says, "Why does tragedy exist? Because you were full of rage. Why are you full of rage? Because you were full of grief." So I think as a novel,
that's an amazing quote.
Yeah, and it's like kind of there, like for me to remember that anytime there's a sense of anger or rage, it's really coming from a sense of grief or loss. And I think that's the case for Izzy and what's going on with him, and that it's really the tremendous amount that he's lost. And as writing a novel is an act of discovery. I don't know what's necessarily going to happen when I enter into a story. I don't necessarily understand what Izzy's been through until I start listening and writing it down. And so he becomes, even if he sort of started in my mind as a type, right? He's a guy, he's going to do these things. He's like the Miami guy. He's like a Pitbull, he's like that. And then as I get to know him, you realize he's a real person. And I think that's it's a good thing for all of us to learn
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
experience and feel.
How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent, savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pate. Fancy Feast gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast gems.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there's one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
When kids don't play, they grow up without creativity. They'll try to blend in and wear chinos, or worse, polyester chinos. Good thing Gushers, Fruit by the Foot, and Fruit Roll-Ups are made to be played with. You better be playing.
He is Ismael, and she is his black whale. And we're given a deep dive into Lolita's interiority, her curiosity about humans, her sadness and depression at being held prisoner and fed inappropriate food, and her attempts to reach out to other species as a means of trying to understand her circumstances in this way that really begins to mirror wonderfully Izzy's search. Perhaps most important is the access at which Izzy's desire to understand how he arrived in Miami as a child coming from Cuba, and Lolita's attempts to remember a world before her prison when they meet and overlap. Can you talk a little bit about that overlap of trying to understand a sort of like foggy and fuzzy past of diaspora and immigration?
Yeah, I think I was sort of trying to play with or address what it means to grow up sort of Cuban American in a city like Miami, where there's a very much a dominant narrative about what life looked like or could have been. I mean, I grew up being, fed these stories about, like, my grandfather being imprisoned when he said that they were going to come to the United States, and different kinds of stories that very much informed a sense of cubanidad, a sense of who you are. And then as you get older, you start having access to, like, looking this stuff up and being like, well, who is this person and when did this happen and what kind of records are there around these things? And just being curious about how much of the story is a story and how much of it is fact.
Mm-hmm.
Questioning memory around it. And again, it doesn't come from a place of disrespect. It comes from a place of wanting to just feel the truth of it, right? And to feel that. And some of that is like led to, learning that I had like an uncle who was actually quite a famous painter, but he wasn't somebody the family talked about very much because he was queer and he stayed behind in Cuba, which are like, two things that sort of made him not a family member that got talked about. But I'm like, why isn't there, you think about who gets left out in these stories and why isn't he in there when he's like arguably kind of my most interesting ancestor? Not disrespects my other ancestors, but I'm like, Enrique sounds cool. And so, that might be the subject of another project, but it is sort of like, but that's something that I try to play with a little bit. And as Izzy goes to meet the people he was on the raft with, and they all have a different version of what happened. They all have a different version of what his mother's role was in these things. And I think I wanted to sort of look at the idea that you really can never know for sure these things, and that there's always some like mystery around it, and that there's some danger in trying to I don't know if there's, I guess it's hard to talk about this is the silliest thing to say to somebody who like interviews writers all the time, but it's so hard to talk about your own work in these ways. I feel like so many of my answers are like, I don't know what I had to, I had to write the book to sort of understand that question. And I don't know what I just know the experience of writing it. And like, the moments where like, he goes to he goes to 2 different homes of people who was on the raft with it in the novel. And one of them tells him like, what could be the truth. And another one is like, I can't talk about that because it's too painful. And it sort of becomes this that the search itself is what matters rather than maybe what you learn.
Mm-hmm. I agree. You clearly love playing with what Mikhail Bakhtin would have called the carnivalesque of narrative registers, with Izzy and his crew's Miami vernacular sprinkled with Spanish, coming right up against chapter titles like Anthropocene, split into two words, and then mixed together with the third-person narrative voice that speaks an entirely different language, a language that we would not have accessibility to were it not for the magic of a novel. And what does that kind of play in narrative registers do in this novel, and how do you think about it as a writer?
I love this question because for me, it was like, my first novel, so this is my fourth book, but it's my second novel. And my first novel is in first person, and it's very much Lizette's perspective. It's what she sees, and you can't know anything that she doesn't know. And when I sort of hit up against the limits of that as in the writing of that novel is when I decided to give her a lot of hindsight, right? That in theory, the point of telling in that novel is like a decade or so, or a couple decades after the events that she is narrating, right? So there is an immediacy in the bulk of the novel, but we sort of begin and end with the idea that we know she has survived the things she's about to tell us that she lived through. And I think with this novel, one, I was like, am I afraid of the third person? Because I realized a lot of my work sort of avoids the third person up to this point. And I was like, can I do it? And also, what are the pleasures of it? What is really push it to the limit, to borrow from Scarface, right? The song that is the title of the montage. I was like, can I really push this to the limit? Can I see how much can a novel hold before it overflows? And I realized, we said deep dive, overflowing, there's a lot of water metaphors, and that's makes sense given about how the book is put together. But I was trying to see how much I could push it in terms of what I let the voice do. And again, it comes sort of back to this idea of water, that I was like, wherever water can go, the book can go. Wherever wherever water can go, the telling can go. And that becomes it's not necessarily explicit for the bulk of the novel, but thinking until that one chapter, which also, just like Anthropocene, it sort of plays, it's the chapter that's called Stereotypes, but it looks like stereotypes. And it's also pronounced by some scientists, they pronounce that word stereotypes. And that's the word for the repetitive actions that animals in captivity display as a symptom of psychosis. Right. So when you see the elephant, going around and around in circles and doing what looks like almost like a dance with their trunk, or when you see animals, marine mammals, when they start like gnawing on the edge of their tanks, that kind of thing, those are called stereotypes or stereotypes. But when you just look at the word on the page, it looks, if you're not reading carefully, right? If you're not a careful reader, I just look like stereotypes.
I can't quantify how funny this novel is. Its humor works on the level of the sentence, with puns and play that always come to the forefront, but it's also playing with, as we've talked about, farce and satire, operating at the meniscus edge of reality and surreality. And, I really love that kind of play that's happening with different kinds of humor. And I'm thinking of, there's a moment that's so funny in which Lolita is describing for us the different birds in Miami, and each bird is both a Miami constant, a stand-in for a certain kind of resident, with the flamingos having been emigrated to Miami from Cuba, but not as exiles. And there's so much of this kind of symbolic play there that's both in that scene, really kind of concentrated, but also in all these different metaphors for community that are run through that kind of humor. And I wonder if you could talk about maybe that scene, but also how that scene is a microcosm of what you're doing with that in other parts of the novel.
Well, that chapter is probably the most explicit in terms of if the reader hasn't figured out that how the book is like Moby Dick, that's where it's explicit as it's going to get, right? Because right before that chapter is a chapter called Invasive Species that follows the characters as they, are trying to hustle and make some money by capturing a bunch of invasive iguanas and dealing with them, right? And then all these birds sort of enter into the end of that scene. And then that chapter ends. And then the next chapter is Birds of Miami-Dade County. And it's a pretty direct sort of reference to like how, Melville will have a chapter where there's, stuff happening on the boat. The plot of that novel, such as it is, it's like stuff happens on a boat until they find a whale. And then there's mentions of knots. And then there's like it stops. And then there's an expository chapter that almost reads like an essay, right, about all the different kinds of knots. And so there are plenty of places in the book where I try to play with that structure of like having a chapter that is very much like plot centered. There's a scene, and then there's a break, and then there's a sort of like expository voice that comes and sort of explains all the different kinds of whatever it is was just kind of being brought up in the previous chapter. So with this one, then this is my knots chapter, right? Or it's like, so Birds of Miami-Dade County, honestly, it just sort of started as a riff of something that I felt was really funny and was initially much longer. And then in the process of revising a book, you know what the book is and you know what you're trying to do. And so you stick with, I knew what was coming in terms of, having, revising that chapter, meaning that like I had already finished a draft of the novel and I knew some of the places where it was going to go. And so I sort of wanted to focus on the whatever birds could metaphorically act as like stands in, like you said, like stand in for the different communities that sort of speak to the entirety of Miami being like people from other places and then sort of claiming that space and inhabiting it. And so, I mean, it was really, but also the sort of like, and I should say, I love Miami. Miami is always going to be my hometown. Miami made me in a lot of ways, for better or for worse. And so the idea of like the one of the birds being the ibis,
I love
and
that
it's not
part.
really an ibis. It's like Sebastian the ibis, which is the mascot for the University of Miami, and that being the bird to talk about. Like, I just feel like that level of like, I really think there are a lot of people. Yeah, I think there are a lot of readers who would be like, yeah, no, that's a legit bird. Like a lot of Miami folks would be like, yeah, that's legit. So I do think the level of like how much of it feels like a farce depends on how close or far you are from the material. But I just had a lot of fun, like really, again, pushing it to the limit and being like, well, how do I make this make sense? How do I justify this like thing that is obviously not a bird? By just inventing details, like the idea that it's made from the feathers of like thousands of dead ibises that have been hand stitched by members of the lifetime members of the Audubon Society. Like, obviously, I don't think that's true. That's not like a fact I found. I totally made it up. But I was like, that would sort of make it real, right? Like, what counts as authentic? And that's sort of what I'm playing with. Like, what counts as authentic? And why does that question come up in the ways that it does? What are we really asking? And in some ways, that's even with Lolita. There's the part where her voice becomes part of the story, where it's like in the chapter The Ocean and It Sets, where she's here too. And so like, she's been in Miami for 50 years. At what point do you get to count as a local when if you're a transplant somewhere? So there's a question of authenticity, pointing out, making fun of, but also weirdly claiming for myself as a Miami person. Yeah. I mean, isn't it? It's possible sometimes when I was thinking about this book, as I was writing it, I was like, am I writing this to prove to myself that I still belong there? Having, as an adult lived other places, every time I go back, it feels, it's a completely different city. And yet it feels extremely familiar. It feels exactly like home. And I feel like I just know how to operate there in a way that I don't in all the other cities that I've lived in. But at the same time, I don't know if people are, I get friends who are visiting, they'll send me a text, I'm in Miami for 36 hours. What should I do? And I'm like, I don't know. There's that thing in the New York Times, 36 hours in Miami. Go read that. I don't know what's cool right now. But I also I think that the sense of what's cool in Miami is also right now being dictated by people who are from New York and LA, rather than, when you look at people's reactions to stuff, we're like, oh, best place to eat in Miami is this. And everybody's like, please, the best place to eat in Miami is Flanagan's or La Carreta, right? Those are the two, or Vicky Bakery, the places that are, I guess, people who live there go to. So I don't know, maybe the whole book is just me trying I know the whole book was me saying goodbye to the city in some ways. There was a part of me that was like, I really don't think I want to write about Miami anymore. And the only way to do it is like exercise the demon, right? Like exorcism, like get it out, put every note I've ever written, every story idea, every like phrase, just get it all in this book and see what comes up. But I've said this before, but it's like I was trying to drain this well that I've, pulling from my entire career. And fortunately, the well is in Miami. So when you get all the water out, it just fills up with more water from underneath, and so like And, as Natasha Trethewey said, like geography is destiny, right? And I think I'm destined to be a writer who's always sort of like fascinated by this place, but also influenced in big ways. If it will always be, I really love what you said. You were like, there's no slack in these sentences. I was like, well, you're just like, oh, you know how to make a writer happy, right? When you say that's it, when you say something like that. But it's just like, yeah, I worked really, really hard to get this to sound the way Miami sounds in my mind. And that was like a really wonderful and grueling process on the sentence level. And I do want to quickly just plug the audiobook if anybody's interested in listening. The narrator, we worked really hard to find like the perfect narrator because I kind of really wanted it to be me. I was like, me, it has to be me. But then they were like, well, we need like an actual like actor to do this. Sorry, and I was like, oh, I narrated my last book. It was fine. And they're like, yeah, that was nonfiction. Kind of made more sense. So I put all these, right? I really made it hard for them. About my age, she has to have grown up in Miami. She needs to be Cuban American or, or Latinx in some way. I basically was like, it's me. I'm going to make it so they can't find anybody. And they found some great, competition for it. And then the person who got it is a writer, or not a writer, an actress named Critia Bajos, and she just nails it. And because she's from there, she just like, well, and she was so wonderful to work with. We talked a lot. We've become pals. I saw her when I was in Los Angeles for the book festival because that's where she's based. And I mean, it's just, she just does such a really, really excellent job because she gets it all. She inflects her voice with when it needs to be, it's like dudes are talking or like the whales sort of like voice entered into it. But overall, it was a question about how much Miami to put in it, because we will both, when we talk on the phone, her and I, like we get into our Miami voice, like we will start talking like we never left, and it comes out, and there's nothing we can do about it because that's what happens with time. But where there's also the question of like, if you narrate a book like that, where like who's going to stay and who's going to write it off and just be like, no, I'm not interested in hearing from someone who talks like this. But that is how the characters sound. So where she really had to play with like, it was brilliant. She just does such a brilliant job. And that's what it is. You got it. You nailed it. It's an interpretation. Like she does, it adds a layer, it adds a dimension. And I think what I really love about it is how, if you listen to the audiobook, you're like, oh, I have to go read it.
Before I let you go, Jennine, I would love to hear a little bit about what you've been reading recently, things that you really want to recommend to listeners of Burned by Books, because we'd love to know.
Yeah, thank you for that question. As I mentioned, this book doesn't exist without Percival Everett's Erasure, which is something that I reread often, and definitely in the creation of this book. And I will say, too, the same goes for Interior Chinatown, which is a novel by Charles Yu, which just it sort of is taking on a lot of the same themes in a completely different way, but also like so much of that novel is presented in Courier New in terms of the font, because it's talking a lot about screenplays and Hollywood and the depiction Asian American actors and what sort of like opportunities they have in Hollywood and what are the limits. And I don't know, it's a really brilliant novel that very much inspired me to keep going, right? When I was in the process of writing Say Hello to My Little Friend. And in terms of like stuff that I'm reading now that I've loved, there's Behind You is the Sea by Susan Muaddi-Darraj. It's a novel that's really wonderful. And
I've been looking
briefly while on tour in Baltimore. I think that's where she's based. And also a forthcoming book, State of Paradise by Laura Vandenberg, which I think comes out in July. I guess I'm technically a Florida writer, but I'm like from Miami, and Miami people are always like, Miami is not Florida, but we are. And showing me her novel, I've read a galley of it, and there's so much synergy between the two projects that we had. We're like pals in real life, but it was very strange there's like Scarface stuff in it, and there's this Scarface as viewed from like Central Florida, right? So whereas in Miami version, Scarface is such a big part of my novel, in hers it's like this like thing that exists there, but it's just sort of like a side quest almost in her book. So yeah, it was just, and she really just gets a sense of like how strange a state Florida can be.
But Jennine, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really loved getting a chance to talk to you.
Great.
Well, that's all from me for now. My great thanks to Kimberly King Parsons for coming on to talk about her outstanding debut, We Were the Universe. You can find links to purchase We Were the Universe and all of Kimberly's recommendations at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in touch. While you're listening, take a moment to rate us on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. And until next time, this has been Burned by Books.